cycle. All right. The cardiac cycle is really just a term for a heartbeat. In other words, a cardiac cycle covers what happens from one heartbeat to the next. So cardiac muscle is alternately contracting and relaxing in one cardiac cycle. So terms. Now, early lab, you already know this, but systole is a term that refers to contraction. Diastole is a term that means relaxation. So we're going to be talking about blood pressure in lab. We're going to be talking about systolic pressure and diastolic pressure. So more about that later. Now notice that systole can refer and does refer to either atria or ventricles. It's mainly ventricular contraction we're concerned with, but the atria do contract somewhat. All right, what we want to know is how atrial and ventricular systole and diastole relate to each other. So this little diagram you have in your notes. So let's talk about this. This diagram here is showing you one cardiac cycle. All right, and so to orient us here, this inner circle here represents both what's happening in the atria and what's happening in the ventricles, as I'll explain. So this right here, these figures represent to you which way blood is flowing and what's happening to the atria and ventricular muscle as you go through. But let's start right up here at 0 milliseconds. So this particular cardiac cycle goes from 0 to 800 milliseconds. All right, so, from 0 to 8/10 of a second. Now, with a cardiac cycle like that, I just happen to know in my head that the heart rate is 75 beats per minute. But more on that later in lab. So let's start right here at 0 and see what's happening. Now, this circle right here represents what's happening in the atria, and this outer rim right here represents what's happening in the ventricles. Are you with me so far? Mm-hmm. All right. So when this heartbeat starts right here, what do we got right here?
It's contracting. The
atrial
atrium.
systole. Mm-hmm. All right. So the atria are contracting right here and emptying themselves of the blood that hasn't yet passed passively into the ventricles. All right, and we come down here to 100 milliseconds. At this point, there is a slight delay in the conducting current within the heart, but at this point right here, atrial systole stops, doesn't it? You see the line? Mm-hmm. All right. Now, what are the atria doing the rest of the way around to the beginning of the next heartbeat?
Resting.
They're resting. They're in diastole. All right. Now let's move to the outer circle. Atrial systole stopped here. Now they're resting. And right here, what's happening? The ventricles are contracting, aren't they? Mm-hmm. This is ventricular systole. Now, does this ventricular systole last all the way around here?
No.
goes to here. Yeah. So actually, in this particular case, our ventricles are only in contraction during 270 milliseconds of the whole cycle, or 0.27 seconds, right? So where does ventricular systole stop? Right here. Now, what are the ventricles doing the rest of the way
Resting.
until we start the next beat?
Resting.
They're resting, aren't they? So actually, the atria and the ventricles at this heart rate are mostly resting, aren't they? Yeah. And notice that the atria and the ventricles are both resting at the same time. Now, as the heart rate goes up, then the time spent in diastole will decrease on it. As you increase the rate, the heart has less time to rest between beats. If this were a slower rate than 800 milliseconds per cycle, then the ventricles would have even more time to rest between beats, wouldn't it? All right? So this is the relationship of the atria and the ventricles in a cardiac cycle. Now notice, the atria are only contracting right here. But once the ventricles rest right here, during atrial diastole, blood that's flowing back into the atria is moving on out of the atria into the ventricles. So most of the blood that comes into the atria moves passively into the ventricles during ventricular diastole, and actually during atrial diastole. When these atria contract right here, they're only emptying themselves of about a third of the total volume of blood that was introduced to them with each beat. So most of that blood flows out of the atria into the ventricles passively.
When that ventricle contracts, isn't it the chordae tendineae that stops it from going back up through the right
Well,
atrioventricular valve or the
blood
left?
from going back. The chordae tendineae
Keeps
keeps the valve from prolapsing
That-
back into the atria and letting blood flow back into the atria
Okay.
from whence it came. We don't want the blood to go back into the atria. We want it to go into the pulmonary trunk and the aorta.
Okay.
All right, so let's review some things based on what we've seen. Remember that blood always flows from an area of higher pressure to an area of lower pressure. And notice that the atria and ventricles are never in systole at the same time. Just let you look at your little chart there. And the atria and the ventricles are both in diastole at the same time for part of the cycle. We saw that on the diagram, didn't we? All right. And we talked about passive flow of blood from the atria and the ventricles. All right. We talked about this 100 millisecond delay at the AV node, didn't we? In other words, the conducting current starts in the SA node, doesn't it? Normally. Spreads through both atria and converges on the AV node, and then passes from there into the AV bundle and into the bundle branches in the interventricular septum, and finally the Purkinje fibers node. All right, now, when that conducting current gets to the AV node, there's a slight delay there, a tenth of a second, before that conducting current gets to the ventricles. And what is that slight delay for? It's to allow the atria to finish their contraction and fully empty themselves of blood before the ventricles begin to contract. All right, and so our AV valves close before the semilunar valves open. Now, I don't know if you remember the tape I showed you from Dr. Ackland where he demonstrated the cadaver heart, and at one point in that tape he shows the closure of opening and closure of the AV valve, and up above you see the opening and closure of the aortic valve, the opening and closure of the left AV valve, the mitral valve, and you can see the opening and closing of the aortic valve up above. I've watched that tape many times, and something they were doing with that water they were putting through there to make the valve open and close was not coordinated, because if you look closely, the mitral valve and the aortic valve were open at the same time. That doesn't happen. That doesn't happen. The aortic and the pulmonary valve open after the AV valves close. Has to be that way. All right. So I don't know what little quirk was going on with that, but otherwise it's a superior tape. All righty. Now what closes the aortic and pulmonary valves?
Back pressure.
Back pressure. Back pressure, exactly. And then, of course, we noted that the ventricles are going to fill passively with blood before the next beat, and they're going to get that extra little squirt of blood when the atria contract, so that they got the full volume of blood from the atria into the ventricles before they contract, and then the cycle repeats. All right, now the next thing we're going to talk about is pressure and volume changes in the cardiac cycle. Now this diagram here is in your textbook, and it is a good diagram to spend a little time with, because you can learn a lot from a diagram like this, because it's addressing a number of things and showing you how they relate to each other with each heartbeat, with each cardiac cycle. So up here at the very top we have the electrocardiogram. Down here, just below it, we're showing you the heart sounds, first and second heart sounds. This part of it right here, we're dealing with pressure changes in the ventricle and in the systemic circuit. Down here, we're talking about volume changes within the ventricle, during one cardiac cycle or one heartbeat. Down here, it's telling you when the atrioventricular valves are open and when they're closed. Down here, it's telling you when the aortic and pulmonary valves are open and when they're closed. And of course, it's relating these phases to the way blood flows through the heart. So let's just look at a few things on this. All right, now, here is the P wave. What does the P wave represent?
The SA node. The SA node.
It represents atrial depolarization, right? We're talking about current. The stimulating current that causes the muscle to contract. All right, that's the P wave. Where is this P wave happening? It's in the atrium, right? It's in the right atrium, SA node. All right, now, this P wave represents the electrical event of atrial depolarization. What follows the electrical event? A mechanical event. Atrial contraction, right? All right, and so let's look right down here. Here's the P wave, and look down here. What follows the P wave mechanically? A little bump in pressure, right? Now, it's not very much pressure, is it? Not very much, but this is atrial depolarization, the electrical event. This is the mechanical event, contraction of the atria that follows it. All right? Now, the next thing, here we've got a little straight line here. This is that pause at the AV node. It allows the atria to finish their contraction before this big event right here. But let's look back up here at this tracing. Here, what does this represent, this QRS? What is that?
It's repolarizing.
Ventricular depolarization, right? Electrical event. what follows the electrical event mechanically?
Ventricular
Ventricular
contraction.
contraction, right? All right, now, when those ventricles, and we're talking about the left ventricle here now, but the right ventricle is going to be doing the same thing, but just to make it simple, we show you just one graph here. So, here now, here's where we are when we start ventricular contraction. And notice the pressure rising. The pressure is rising here. Now, look back up here. Here's the first heart sound. What causes the first heart sound? The low. Valve closure. Which valves?
Oh yeah, sounds makes a noise. The ventricular valve.
Right?
Yeah.
So this is the first heart sound. So as the pressure builds in the left ventricle, and we generate enough pressure to slam the AV valve shut, that gives you the first heart sound.
Okay.
All right, that's the low right there. Now, this green line up here represents the pressure existing in the systemic circuit in this person, this example right here. All right. This line right here represents what's happening, represents what's happening in the ventricle.
Okay.
All right? So pressure is building in the left ventricle. The AV valves close right here. Now, where on here does the aortic valve open?
Just before the second sound wave, before the second noise,
Right here.
right around. Okay, so it's much further before.
It's right here is where the aortic valve opens.
Okay.
Because the ventricle has to generate enough pressure to overcome the existing pressure in the aorta, just beyond the valve. That valve is not going to open till the pressure in the ventricle is higher than the pressure in the aorta, right? Because there's blood in that aorta under pressure, isn't there? Yes. So when the pressure gets to this point, just a little higher than, 78 or so, when it's just over 80, that aortic valve opens, and now blood flows into the aorta, doesn't it? All right? Now, we know that this ventricular contraction only lasts part of the whole cycle, right? So this is the maximum pressure generated by the ventricle in its contraction, but then it begins to relax, doesn't it? And the pressure falls off, doesn't it? So from right here to over here, the aortic valve is open, isn't it? But when the pressure in the ventricle drops below this, what happens?
The aortic semilunar valve closes.
The aortic valve closes, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And this is the second sound right here. All right? Now, this was the electrical event, ventricular depolarization. This is the mechanical event, ventricular contraction. And this T wave here on the tracing represents ventricular repolarization, getting ready for the next beat. Now remember, we did not see a deflection in here for atrial repolarization, did we? But it's happening. It's just hidden in the QRS. The QRS is stronger, so it hides the ventricular repolarization. All right? So now our pressure drops right here. The aortic valve closes, and we get the second sound. And now the ventricle and the atria are relaxing, as we saw in our cardiac cycle. And now we're getting ready for the next beat. And you're going to repeat the same thing that you just saw here. All right, now let's look at the volume changes in the ventricle related to the pressure changes. All right, so the ventricle is filling in here, isn't it? All right, so these things here represent volume change. So EDV stands for end diastolic volume. In other words, this means the volume of blood that's in the ventricle at the end of diastole just before ventricular systole. And in this diagram right here, it's reading 130 milliliters, isn't it? We're reading millimeters of mercury pressure here. We're reading volume down here. So 130 milliliters at the beginning of ventricular systole. In other words, this relates to this. Now, as the ventricle contracts, it empties itself of its blood, doesn't it? So the volume of blood in the ventricle is going to decrease, isn't it? As blood flows out of it. This is at the end of ventricular systole right here. And so if we read down here, it says at the end of ventricular systole, we've got 70 milliliters of blood still in the ventricle. I'm having a hard time seeing it too. But that's all that little thing will do. It's only got those 2 little batteries. I can't make it do any better. But I use my finger. So we start here and we end up down here. All right. Now, what's the difference between 130 and 70? 60. All right. So how much blood did this ventricle pump out with that beat?
60 milliliters.
60 milliliters, right? All right. Now, when it pumped out all it was going to pump out, it was left with still some volume in there, as you can see down here. That's called the end systolic volume, ESV, which means the volume of blood that's left in the ventricle after its contraction, the end systolic volume. Now the difference between those two is this, SV, stroke volume. In other words, with that beat, with that stroke of the heart, it put out 60 milliliters of blood. 60 milliliters of blood. That's the stroke volume. You follow me so far on this? Okay. Now, so again, this would be a good diagram to go back and look at, because you're relating all of these things together on that one chart. All right, heart sounds. So heart sounds are caused by valve closure, aren't they? Valve closure. When the AV valves snap shut, that's the first sound, the low. When the aortic and pulmonary valves shut by back pressure, that duck is the second sound. So in a normal heart, you don't hear sounds when valves are open. You hear sounds when valves close, unless there's valve damage for some reason. If, say, the mitral valve is damaged and doesn't close fully when the ventricles contract, that lub might be a little, you might hear a little turbulence created by blood flowing back across a valve that's only partially closed. Whereas if you've got, say, damaged aortic valve, say that's tough and tight, stenotic, and doesn't open fully, so that duct might be the lub, because blood is being forced through a smaller opening that normally it would flow through if that aortic valve doesn't open fully. So abnormal sounds are called murmurs, heart murmurs. You can listen for the various valves by moving the stethoscope around the different places on the chest, as you see here. And so if you've ever had a physician listen to your heart, you may have noticed that he or she moved the stethoscope
Second intercostal and fourth intercostal.
around and was listening for places where you best hear the valves. For example, the mitral valve is best heard not directly over the valve, but down here at the apex of the heart.
And that's because the sternum is covering up those
Well,
valves?
partly that, and partly just the way the heart is shaped
Okay,
and the way the sounds are transmitted.
okay.
All right, so that brings us to cardiac output. Cardiac output is just the volume of blood that the ventricles pump each minute. And we're talking about the left ventricle, basically. So it's the volume of blood pumped by each ventricle in 1 minute, but generally we're concentrating on the left ventricle. Okay, so it's usually measured in liters, so many liters per minute. So if you have a man who is, has a cardiac output of 5 liters per minute, he's basically moving his whole blood volume through the heart every minute. Basically. So cardiac output is just an indication of ventricular efficiency over time. It can be measured in a number of ways. It can be measured with sophisticated laboratory devices or even by ultrasound. You can measure the output of the heart by ultrasound. Now, how do you figure cardiac output? Well, this is the formula right here. Cardiac output equals stroke volume times heart rate. Does that make sense?
Yes.
All right. On that little diagram, we saw that each beat of the heart put out 60 milliliters of blood, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, however many times that happens in a minute is the cardiac output, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So stroke volume, as I showed you before, is just the difference between these two volumes right here, as I showed you on that diagram. Now, there are factors that affect those two variables, stroke volume and heart rate. So let's look at some factors that affect stroke volume. All right, end diastolic volume first. Ventricular filling time is influenced by heart rate. Think about that for a minute. A heart that's beating at a fairly slow rate, those ventricles have more time to fill, don't they? As the rate progressively increases, those ventricles have less time to fill with each beat, right? Now, does that mean necessarily that the heart rate is going to go down? It might, especially with very high rates, but if the heart beats more forcefully with each beat and puts out more volume per beat, then cardiac output is not necessarily going to go down. So the slower the heart rate, the longer the filling time, the faster the heart rate, the shorter the filling time. Now, at very high heart rates, cardiac output will decrease unless the heart can compensate by increasing the return of blood to the heart and beat more forcefully. So, as you get up to heart rates of 160, 170, and higher, those ventricles are really contracting very rapidly, and they have very little time to fill with blood. And there's going to come a point when that cardiac output is going to fall way off, way off. All right, now, venous return is just a term we use to measure the rate of blood flow back to the heart from the body. So venous return to the heart. We're talking about blood returning back to the heart. A number of factors can affect venous return, but in general, as venous return decreases, cardiac output decreases, and vice versa. As you increase venous return, usually cardiac output increases.
What are some of the factors that can affect the venous return? When you hear like people having poor circulation, does that have anything to do with it?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
No. Dehydration,
Okay.
for example,
Okay.
would decrease venous return.
Okay.
You have a lower circulating blood volume. Blood loss
Okay. Makes sense.
causes decrease of severe burns when you're losing a lot of fluid from the body.
Yeah.
You've got decreased venous return, blood pressure goes down.
Okay.
Yeah. Things that would increase venous return would be exercise.
Mm-hmm.
When you exercise, you increase blood pressure and blood flow, and that blood is flowing back to the heart faster. People with damaged hearts, congestive heart failure, they have fluid backup,
Okay.
and so they're not pumping efficiently.
So when someone exercises and that venous return is going through faster, it's going from the atrium into the ventricle faster on its own without the contraction, is that why their heart rate is slower? Because it doesn't have to contract as much because the body's...
No,
No.
when you exercise, your heart rate goes up,
Okay.
unless,
But your resting heart rate, I mean.
or your resting heart rate.
Yeah.
Well-conditioned athletes get more out of each heartbeat.
Okay.
In other words, their stroke volume goes up, is higher, therefore their heart rate doesn't have to be as high.
Okay.
Because cardiac output is stroke volume times heart rate.
Okay.
So if your stroke volume is really very good and very high, then you can slow down your heart rate,
Okay.
right? So well-conditioned athletes will commonly have a heart rate less than 60 beats per minute.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with it. Doesn't mean
Right.
they're sick.
Right.
It just means that
They're efficient.
with each beat of the heart, it's delivering more blood out of itself.
Okay.
All right, so that was end diastolic volume. Here are some factors that affect end systolic volume. Think back on our diagram. End diastolic volume is up here, heart beats, we move blood out of the heart, and we've got end systolic volume down here. All right, three things: preload, contractility, and afterload. What do those things mean? Well, basically, preload has to do with the degree of stretching of those cardiac muscle fibers before the ventricle contracts. In general, the more you stretch those fibers before they contract, in other words, the more blood that fills the ventricle before it contracts and stretches those fibers, the higher the stroke volume is going to be.
Okay.
All right?
Okay.
Up to a point. So let me show you something here from skeletal muscle physiology, and I'll make the analogy to cardiac muscle. In skeletal muscle, remember, skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle both have sarcomeres, don't they? And you have actin and myosin interacting together, don't you? Those two proteins, contractile proteins. All right, these are our little diagrams of sarcomeres. Remember those? And so the red here would be the actin molecules, and the blue would be the myosin heads, wouldn't they? All right. Now, if we have a situation in a skeletal muscle where these two are crowded up like this so that when we get neural stimulus to contract skeletal muscle, they can't move very far, can they? So we won't create a lot of tension down here with this, will we? But as we get a more optimal positioning of actin and myosin here, like right here, when these move, you know, the myosins move centrally, don't they? You'll get better tension. You felt with me so far? But out here, if you stretch the muscle fibers too far, you separate the actin and myosin from each other, and you only have minimal contact here of myosin heads with actin molecules, and your tension falls way off down here. The same thing happens in the heart. If you overfill it, overstretch the fibers with blood, too much blood in there, or a weak heart is not emptying itself efficiently with each beat while still receiving more blood, the fibers keep stretching, and you get very weak contraction out here. This is what happens in congestive heart failure.
And it's not always on the left side?
It can be. It typically is usually in the left side,
Okay.
but you can have failure on the right side too.
You can, okay.
Okay. So anyway,
Excuse me, doctor. With the excessive stretching, does that have anything to do with enlarged hearts?
Not necessarily. I mean, it can be made larger just by the stretching, but an enlarged heart will be more commonly produced by a heart that's overworking against too much resistance. In other words, if you've got too much resistance out here, as we'll discuss next week in blood pressure and circulation, if that heart is having to work extra hard to get the blood out of itself, or if you've got an aortic valve that's tight and the heart is not able to deliver, the ventricle is not able to deliver its blood with each stroke fully out of there, that you are going to stretch the fiber, and the cardiac muscle fibers are going to build up and increase their bulk, and the heart will get large, and you'll get left ventricular hypertrophy from an overworked heart. All right, but that's what I was showing you right here with this preload thing. That's what this is right here. All right? Contractility just refers to the force produced during a contraction. So if a heart is beating normally, it's healthy, you get, a good force with each contraction. Autonomic input affects that. Sympathetic stimulation increases the force of contraction. Parasympathetic stimulation decreases the force of contraction. So if you're exercising, get sympathetic stimulation, you get more forceful contraction.
Okay.
If you are eating a big meal and lying down taking a nap after that, you're going to get parasympathetic stimulation and your heart is not going to work as hard. Certain hormones will increase the force, like epinephrine and norepinephrine, also thyroid hormone. All right, then we have something called afterload. This is basically the tension that the ventricle must produce in order to eject blood. In other words, in order to open that aortic valve and put blood into the aorta, this is the tension that has to be produced. And you saw back on our little chart here on our diagram that, well, let's just run back here just a minute. We'll look at it. You see right here, when this ventricle starts to contract, that aortic valve is not open yet, is it? And when is it open?
When you get more pressure than what's already
more
there.
pressure that's in the aorta. All right? So That's what afterload is talking about here. Now, what are some things that can increase afterload? Well, again, our example of aortic valve. If that aortic valve is tight, it's stenotic, it's not opening freely, that ventricle has to pump harder to get the blood out of itself across a narrow opening. This instead of this. All right? And so you increase the work the ventricle has to do, you increase the afterload. Someone who has high blood pressure, say somebody has a blood pressure of 190 over 125. All right. That 125 is the pressure existing in the aorta between heartbeats, isn't it?
The resting.
So the ventricle has to contract hard enough to overcome that pressure before blood will even get out of the ventricle. So you're increasing the work, the tension that has to be produced by the ventricle in order to get blood out of itself. All right, so those are some factors that affect stroke volume. Now what's the formula for cardiac output? Stroke volume times heart rate.
Yeah.
So now we got to look at heart rate.
Okay.
Some things that affect heart rate. Well, again, venous return affects heart rate. It affects stroke volume, and it affects heart rate. So, when you get a higher volume of blood returning to the right atrium, that higher volume of blood stretches the walls of the right atrium and initiates a reflex known as the atrial or Bainbridge reflex, which increases heart rate. So when you stretch the walls of the right atrium by increasing the volume of blood returning, you get an automatic increase in the heart rate to accommodate that extra volume of blood. All right? Autonomic input. Again, sympathetic discharge increases heart rate. Parasympathetic discharge decreases heart rate. And again, our hormones will affect heart rate certainly. Adrenergic hormones like epinephrine and norepinephrine, metabolic hormones like thyroid will increase heart rate. This is just some other ways of looking at things that affect stroke volume. You can look at it as things that affect the heart proximal to itself, like venous return, acting on the heart itself, diseased heart, drugs, so forth, or distal to the heart, like high blood pressure. Factors that affect heart rate, you got a number of things that can affect heart rate. I just gave you a few, but ionic imbalance, certain drugs, hormones, low blood pressure, all those things will affect heart rate.
The ionic imbalance, does that have to do with the sodium?
Sodium
pump, this potassium pump?
balance.
Okay.
All right, exercise and cardiac output. When you exercise, your cardiac output goes up to meet the demand that your muscles are calling for. They're calling for more blood supply and more oxygen. And most healthy people can increase their cardiac output several times, and well-conditioned athletes even more. But again, as you increase the heart rate progressively, when you get up to the very high rates, cardiac output is going to fall off because those ventricles don't have sufficient time to fill with enough blood to maintain blood pressure and cardiac output. What's the highest you've gotten your heart rate, anybody?
165, 170.
200.
200? You've gotten your heart rate to 200?
He's a cyclist.
How'd you do it?
I was just biking.
Biking?
I put up the time and can.
Pardon?
I put up the bike as time and can I do in the gym.
Oh, okay. And 200, and you're still conscious?
I know.
That's what I'm saying.
It's gonna be a lot harder than that.
Isn't that your heart just feels like it's gonna come out of the chest?
Yeah.
No, I did that for like an hour.
I don't know. That thing was wrong.
That's pretty unusual.
I don't think so.
I've got mine to 160, that's about how I get mine.
160, I think.
Mine's tripping at that rate.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Sorry. Now, see, because I do the same, I'll work out now, I do the elliptical, and I'll get, my heart rate goes up really fast compared to, my weight friends. But I have mitral valve prolapse, so where sometimes it regurgitates back into the chambers that it's not supposed to, so does that affect why my heart rate jumps faster than